All right, we're good to go. Can see your slide, Achim.
Okay. Wasn't sure if you wanted to say something. Okay. Yeah. So I will keep the talk deliberately less or non-technical for the audience that we usually have. But it's something that currently seems to gain more attraction. And it's also something where, on the one hand, I'm very much interested in it from a technical and a research perspective. And on the other side, you will see that at the end and towards the conclusion, I'm also rather frustrated with what is going on in a certain way. Um, I think I've given a couple of years ago already a talk about software supply chain attacks. That's essentially the bigger motivation of the topic of today, where we look at the threats that are essentially occurring in software development if we look at the software development environment of the actual software developers. So you might remember those headlines. They're already a couple of years old. British Airways did face a high fine for a data breach. Equifax in the US is most likely even more well known. Also, a data breach where personal data was leaked and the companies had to pay fines in both cases. And in both cases, the actual normal piece of software, so the piece of the software stack that had been attacked by the bad actors, was not something that either British Airways or Equifax did develop themselves. It was actually some open source components that they included in their software stack, and they're still liable for that. And these kind of events, together with Heartbleed, for those that still remember Heartbleed, essentially woke up the software industry in terms of we have a supply chain issue, and most software that is being developed today consists out of 80% or so of components that are already available, and many of them publicly available open source components. More recently, so those two examples are both non-intentional vulnerabilities being exploited by a threat actor based on the fact that the vulnerabilities are publicly known. More recently, we had that XSAT backdoor where somebody invested over several years the effort to infiltrate the software development of an open source component, namely a compression library that then is being used in certain circumstances in SSH, which is a tool for remote access to servers. And essentially, they implanted a backdoor, and that was detected essentially by a clever Microsoft engineer that spotted that the runtimes, the performance degraded a little bit, and investigated that. And as said, that woke up the software industry, and we have several initiatives that try to protect those components and the software developers. So there's a best practice batch program from the Core Infrastructure Initiative, which is part of the Linux Foundation, that awards badges to open source projects if they follow best practices in secure software development. That I haven't seen that many badges, to be honest, but it's one of the initiatives. GitHub, that was something that was widely discussed, made two-factor authentication mandatory. So GitHub is essentially a Microsoft operated, in the meantime, service where a lot of open source projects host their source code and develop their source code on. And if, of course, an account there is overtaken by a bad actor, they might modify that source code. GitHub made that more difficult, and software companies are keeping now more rigorously track about the software they actually use and maintain something called a software bill of material. So that's all good and working well, but there's still at least one area that hardly anybody looks at the moment. Let's have a quick look how software developers actually interact with their code. I mean, code doesn't just exist by I'm thinking about I want to write an algorithm and suddenly there's some source code, some program code available. They use something called integrated development environments, and the oldest amongst us might remember something like the famous Borland IDE from the 90s. More modern, there are IDEs like Visual Studio from Microsoft or Xcode from Apple. And all three of them essentially have in common that they have been developed by a large software company for a very specific purpose, so for very specific development environments, and are not very much configurable from the end user, which in this scenario is the developer. And these are kind of the fat, heavy, old school IDEs. The younger generation seems to prefer more IDEs that are much closer to standard text editors. So think about the younger generation seems to prefer Notepad over Microsoft Word. It's less overloaded, but a version of Notepad where they can configure and add the features that they need, but don't install the features that they don't need. And the most famous one of those configurable, more lightweight IDEs is confusingly called Microsoft Visual Studio Code, or VSCode for short. And you can see here already on that screenshot, there's a lot of extensions available, and there's a marketplace for those extensions. So if you program in Python, for example, Visual Studio Code will not support Python by default. You have to install an extension. If you interact with a certain cloud provider and want to have support for that, you install an extension. If you don't like the color scheme of the IDE, you install a theme, which technically is also an extension. And while the core product, so Visual Studio Code, is provided by Microsoft and goes through all the rigid software development processes that Microsoft has, those extensions are being developed by everybody. There are essentially small JavaScript programs that are relatively easy to develop. With a little bit of programming background, it costs you maybe half an hour to build a small extension, and maybe even less taking an existing one and modifying it. So the entrance barrier is very low. And yeah, that results in a new attack vector. So as I already said, the extensions are written in JavaScript. From a technical perspective, you can think about Visual Studio Code as being a web application that runs in a dedicated browser, or the core of a web browser. For those of you that are a little bit more technical, it's an Electron app. That's the framework that is being used for developing those type of applications. All the extensions essentially run with the same privileges as Visual Studio Code itself. There's not much of a permission system. There's a little bit currently emerging, but not much. So the security model of Visual Studio Code essentially is yet to mature. And that then results in people misusing those extensions for attacks. I've selected three example ones that I want to briefly talk on a very high level. The first one is actually a security research company that developed a proof of concept and actually published that on the marketplace. I'm not sure what the ethics on that is. I wouldn't do that with my students, but they did. And the interesting experience there is it took round about 30 minutes from publishing the extension on the market store before they saw first installs in their backend system, so that a proof of concept extension essentially notified them whenever somebody was installing that extension and using it, and it was essentially a modified version of a color theme. Took them 30 minutes, and after 2 or 3 days, extension became more popular, and even very large enterprises in large numbers were suddenly popping up in their log file, and they then did a responsible disclosure to all those companies affected. Similarly, there's another one which also is a fake version or a copied version from a theme. Also became very quickly popular, exfiltrating also data about the development machine. Keep in mind, on a software development machine, you have most likely configuration files lying around that, and authentication files and configurations that allow you to access your backend cloud services where you deploy your software repositories where the source code is being stored, and all those credentials can potentially be read by that extension and being exfiltrated. That's maybe also more of a smaller issue here. The one that really had a severe impact is this one, where a Chinese, or it's at least attributed to a Chinese espionage group, used Visual Studio Code extension in their attack chain, and exactly for the purpose of exfiltrating data to their command and control servers. So they used the developer's machine with a vulnerable application to exfiltrate information out of large enterprises. So there's a real threat here. And the first question that we can ask ourselves is, how do we actually convince people to install an extension if we build a malicious extension? And that's actually, sadly, very easy. If we search in the extension marketplace, for example, for Python, which is one very famous programming language, we first see that a lot of those extensions use the same logo, that blue and yellow Python or snake symbol here, which is essentially the logo of the programming language. So they look visually very similar. And they also have very similar names. If you look in the last line here, the second and third extension that we see here is Python snippets without a hyphen, so a space between Python and snippets. And the other one is Python snippets with a hyphen. That's called a typo squatting attack. And we can see also here, if we look closely at the very last line, they have nearly 1 million installations, so 985,000 and 800,000 installations. So they're more or less similarly popular. And it's very easy to confuse them. I wouldn't know which of those two extensions I want to install, which developer to trust. And that's essentially what people are exploiting to convince people to install it. So most of the attacks that we are aware of use essentially an existing extension, modified, include the malicious code into that extension, republish it on the marketplace with a very similar or even the identical name. You can even publish two extensions that have the same name because the system internally distinguishes them by an ID, which most people don't look at very closely. Why should you? Which is also rather frightening. Let's get to the lessons learned. If you now say, oh, that's boring, that all sounds very familiar, yes, you're right. One interesting aspect is this security threat on attacking software developers with the core tools, editors, and compilers from a security perspective has been the very first time discussed 1984 by Ken Thompson, one of the inventors of the C programming language, who in a paper theoretically discussed the threat of a malicious actor modifying a C compiler in a way that it emits a code that has a different behavior than what the C code that the software developer wrote has, for example, automatically includes a backdoor. You can do the same also with a Visual Studio Code extension. You can easily write an extension that shows different source code to the software developer than what is actually being sent to the compiler. So you don't need to fiddle around with a rather complex piece of software. The compiler, you can actually modify the source code before it enters the compiler and trick the developer. And that's also interesting from a perspective. In 1984, information security, IT security, wasn't a very hot topic. So it's also very enlightening that Ken Thompson thought about that at a time where essentially we were using multi-user Unix systems without passwords, or a lot of people had empty passwords and the like. And he was already thinking about those kind of attack vectors. In every system that has an app store, be it your mobile phone applications, being browser extensions, we have typo squatting or logo image confusion. There's no proper name for that. So it's also not a new attack vector. And browser extensions and the risk, which essentially is exactly the same. Everybody can publish very easily a web browser extension that then people install into a web browser, have full control over everything, what you do with your web browser, so your banking details and everything. That is something that we were looking in nearly 10 years ago already and gave talks about. The difference is the web browsers in the meantime have for their extension at least a very fine-grained permission model. And for good or bad, the power that browser extension have are being restricted, and we currently have the discussions about, is Google restricting, for example, advertisement blockers for security reasons or because it might harm their business model? Maybe there's a truth in both, but an advertisement blocker essentially changes the information that you see versus what the websites want you to see. And you can easily see that if you're on your e-banking application and such an extension is running, it could easily modify the balances that you see on wire transfers and the like. So, and that's then the frustrating part, at least for me. We do not seem to learn from our mistakes. And with we, I mean the security community. Also, the Visual Studio Code extension, but also the browser extensions, the attacks that we see there are handled rather intransparently. You always see extensions being removed from the store, but you hardly learn why and what is the story behind that. They are removed, but that doesn't protect the people that have those extensions still installed. On browsers, we see in the meantime that the browser pops up, says, hey, you have an extension installed that is no longer being offered. You might want to deinstall that extension. That is missing in Visual Studio Code at the moment. Maybe that is being added. Hopefully also a permission model is being added. And for me, the really frustrating part is a large company, Microsoft, with a lot of security experience, builds a new IDE with an obvious attack vector and still decides to make it open and easy extensible because that makes the thing more popular on the short term, and works in a security as an afterthought model instead of secure by default. So it still seems to be that security as an afterthought might be the more successful business model, which is really frustrating. And last but not least, for me, that is a project where I'm usually supervising undergrad and master students. So over the last couple of years, I had several students working on tools for analyzing extensions, so looking at their source code, finding vulnerable components being used for the development, or trying to identify backdoors. That is a super hard problem. So we cannot expect that Microsoft, for example, can scan all the extensions and find everything when you upload something to the marketplace, but the barrier could be much higher than it is at the moment. Tools for analyzing Visual Studio, the marketplace itself, so looking at phishing attacks, looking, for example, how many extensions are there where only one character is being changed in the name that still use the same logo, where the description is similar, and try to draw conclusions from that. And we also work on threat models and proof of concept attacks, but we don't publish our proof of concept attacks, and we would never upload them to the marketplace. That's mainly for validating if the attack ideas that we have and where we develop analysis tools for are actually viable and would work in practice if somebody would do that. Yeah, and the broader key takeaways here for me really is, yes, building secure systems is hard, but that cannot be an excuse for making, as a security community, the same mistakes over and over again. Outsourcing security to end users, victim blaming, those stories of the human as the weakest link is not something that should be done. We are lacking here, obviously, a lot of technical mitigations that we know how to implement. They just cost a little bit of effort. And as long as we are not doing that, we cannot fully rely on end users doing that. That should always be the technology helping the users and not relying on the users. And generally, not only for browsers, not only for Visual Studio Code or similar tools, wherever you have products that allow people to install add-ons or extensions, that is usually a piece of software that is fully overlooked by IT security policies, that is in most cases not included in company policies and device monitoring and the like, and they often can be installed by end users without any approval and checking. They're a part of the so-called shadow IT, and they might include also, for example, new AI tools that send company data out to some third-party servers elsewhere for analysis. So for any business size, thinking about policies about add-ons is a good idea. That's all from my side, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Achim. Yeah, very interesting, and as you say, very Groundhog Day-ish as well. Because I remember when I was in Silicon Valley and had a software development team that actually were contributors to the GNU stack, and the work we used to do to make sure that whatever went in absolutely was as clean as anything, and how that was just part of the development process. And it just seems that we now create these easily accessible tools for developers to just quickly do stuff, and efficiency is trumping security in the commercial models, as you say. And that's kind of like, well, come on, guys, we've known about this for 30, 40 years. It's not probably longer. It's incredible, isn't it? So any questions from anyone else in the audience? Just stick your hand up or just jump on in.
Can I ask a question to Achim in terms of, Achim, you talked about these guys, the uploading malicious applications to the Microsoft Store. How are they doing that? And I'll qualify my question by saying that with one of my clients, we have uploaded an application, a commercial application to the Microsoft Store, and it took us months to get Microsoft to accept it. Now, are they finding a backdoor into the Microsoft Store, or is it a different part of the Microsoft Store specifically for developers?
It's a completely different store. So if you want to get applications into the official Microsoft Store, so the one where you then install Windows applications from, you have to go through a rather, at least from a process level, an audit perspective, strict vetting process,
Yeah.
I would say. And if you do more critical device drivers and the like, you might even need to hand over your source code to Microsoft for analysis.
Yeah.
Here for Visual Studio Code, that's an open marketplace. You open up an account, you upload it, 5 minutes later, essentially, it's publicly available.
Is it a Microsoft store, or is it a third-party store that allows you to upload?
It is operated by Microsoft.
Okay. Yeah, because our scenario was that first one where we had to supply source code, and it took months. And,
Yeah.
and it was very, very painful. So when you were talking about uploading this very quickly and easily, I was just wondering how the hell they did it because
No,
you've
no,
got an opportunity there.
they didn't circumvent anything there. Those are two different stores
Right.
with completely different
Yeah.
policies, but both happen to be operated by parts of Microsoft.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. That answers my question. That clears that up.
Yeah, it kind of raises the question that I think Achim alluded to, which is, it's not that Microsoft doesn't understand this. So if they're deciding to facilitate this attack vector, the only logical conclusion is they're doing it because they see it as a commercial accelerator. They want to get lots of, committed service providers. They want a code base of developers out there adding these add-ons, and they just allow, open the door to anything, anywhere, and lower the gate to assessment, security assessment, to get it going. But this one's been going for how long? This one's been going quite a while, right, Akin?
Yeah, I mean, Visual Studio Code is being popular at least since 5 years or so, I would guess.
Yeah.
We
So if this
slowly
is on,
see some permission models being implemented, but yeah, essentially it still looks like Emacs in many cases where one extension can also modify the behavior of other extensions and they are not sandboxed against each other.
oh wow,
So yeah,
okay. So
Yeah,
you can piggyback. Oh dear. Okay, it's
Jeff,
even
Jeff, I have
worse.
a question, if that's all right, Taki. I just wondered what his views or advice are about how can we use like out the institutions like the IET, the BCS, and these things to really lobby like these big companies and ultimately to they add that sort of assurance level because that's what we need from Microsoft. There is if they want people to use this tool. If the worst case is if we stop using it because it just becomes like a wild west. So how what the views does he have about like really sort of lobbying these non-government organizations to really bring that voice to the likes of Microsoft, or is it just we are you know these are giants and we're having that we're a small voice over the
I
global
think
market.
that's an interesting question. I think that the lobbying happens, and there is a certain liability from the Microsoft side as well, because as I said, they are offering that product for free. It's essentially an open source product of Microsoft, but it's distributed via their official channels and they operate that marketplace. Um, I really believe they have made a careful business decision saying for this product to gain attraction, we need those extensions, similar as maybe Android at the beginning said we need applications to make that mobile platform attractive. And we take the risk that comes with everybody being able to easily write extensions. We just take that risk that seems to be justified and we tighten on the screws in terms of security later.
So essentially, what we're saying is it's down to the IT security policy enforcers for the software developers to be looking at this kind of thing. But the only question I would have is, how do you tell whether or not you're looking at a malicious um, extension or not? I mean, I don't think there's any real way to tell, is there?
There is no 100% guarantee. But I mean, you can have certain indicators like there are extensions published by certain authors. So the Python extension, for example, the official one is being officially provided by Microsoft. You would expect, I don't know, a Java extension may be provided by Oracle or some other big player in the Java environment scope, Java world. I haven't checked actually who provides that. The number of installations is an indicator. The last update is an indicator. We are getting into the same type of indicators that people use for deciding which GitHub repository or which open source library is most likely trustworthy. There are one or two commercial tools at least that allow you to restrict for web browsers, and they should also be applicable then to Visual Studio Code and similar applications, which extensions you can install.
Sure, yeah, you can limit it. It's just a question of, it wasn't so much about the ability to limit it, it was more of a question about the ability to select safe ones. But as you say, it comes down to just going with trusted sources, because there's no other way of assessing. Apart from, one assumes, as an extension, you can actually get into the code and look at what it's up to.
Yes.
But that's about the best you can do.
You can look into the source code. There are JavaScript extensions, but we all know that that problem is, from a theoretical perspective, undecidable. And I mean, you can increase the barriers. There's just no easy way of giving a 100% guarantee, but you can give maybe 80, 90% guarantee.
Yeah, I mean, like any other code, 80% of it is libraries they've pulled in from elsewhere, and you're then going down the rabbit hole of all of the supply chains. So,
I mean, the other point is the platform could implement a permission model. We see that on web browsers, but then people also need to check the permissions being requested. For the web browser extensions, we did a study. We looked into calculator extensions, extensions that just provide a simple calculator feature. That's obviously a feature that you can implement in JavaScript. That extension doesn't need any permission. And we found hundreds of extensions requiring the permission that can read and modify all your web traffic. And for those, just to make it very clear, that happens in the browser before, respectively, after the end decryption step of TLS.
Yeah, so it sees everything. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point. That's one sort of thing to really highlight, is the client-side hack value of this vector. Is it gets in before information is encrypted or anything else, because it's working at your localized privilege level. So
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. No, that was really interesting. There was also a quick question, actually a couple more questions just quickly come in, and we'll see if we can just quickly go through them. Are there other similar Microsoft stores to the VSC that we are discussing? Well, I bet there are.
I'm not aware of Microsoft operated other stores for those type of extensions, but that's not a statement that they don't exist.
Yeah. And could we use an AI-driven permission model to authorize code extensions? It's just
In theory, yes. I'm a little bit skeptical with a lot of AI application in the security space, mainly due to the reason that the most AI is optimized for detecting common cases. An AI that detects the exceptional cases is less well developed. And in the security space, we have the problem that data that we would need to train the AI is confidential. So we have very little data that we can train AI on. But that would be definitely something to look into.
Yeah. And Daniel's come in, they're coming in thick and fast now. I think the really interesting part of this is not that these extensions exist, it's that anyone who's worked with developers from a security standpoint meets the clash between security and developers, where they want autonomy to download, install what they want, and have local admin. Yeah, that's definitely true. Developers need a lot of freedom, they need a lot of autonomy, and they need to be trusted. But at the same time, are they being educated and connected up with these issues and challenges? They're not all as smart as they think they are. Unfortunately. Otherwise, these guys wouldn't be putting these hacks into these extensions, right? So, interesting stuff. All right, brilliant. Very interesting talk. Thank you, Achim. I think we need to move on to our next speaker, which is Simon. Simon, over to you to talk about the insider threat, now that we've looked at it from the software developer perspective in some ways, anyway.
Thank you, Achim. That was really interesting. You've kind of come at it from a completely different angle to myself. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Can you hear me okay?
No problem.
Excellent. So my first caveat is that I've been speaking for 3 days solid at expos. So if my voice peters off by the end of this, that'll be my reason why. So good morning, everybody. My name's Simon Cuthbert. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for it's now actually 33 years last week we worked out, which is kind of impressive, but also quite sad at the same time that I've been around. I've worked for, I've spent the majority of my career working with the kind of leading edge technology providers of the time. Really interested always to work with technology companies that have got a new and innovative way of doing things. The likes of Content Technologies, who were the first real email detection company, and they had Mail Sweeper and Web Sweeper. If you go back that far, through to Baltimore Technologies and ClearSmith with PKI, Varonis with access the first real access rights management and file detection solution, through to AAP networks with email encryption. Some years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, I decided that, or people decided for me that I was actually quite unemployable because I was a bit of a disruptor within organizations. So I took the leap to create VAR Channels, which is a company that helps organizations generally not UK based enter the UK market. And that has sprung out some other business lines for me as well. So I was part of a GDPR working group looking at Articles 5, 33, and 34 around data loss prevention and how GDPR was actually workable in the real life. So a whole bunch of technology people and lawyers would write the articles, and then I'd be part of a working group that would actually say this is actually something that is workable in the real life. And there was a lot of conversations backwards, forwards on that. I'm a cross-parliamentary advisor on cybersecurity. I spend a day a month in the Houses of Parliament with a cross-parliamentary group looking at the latest threats of the day. Not all of that is cyber. Some of that we've spent a lot of time talking around Ukraine and Russia and other things as well. I'm a speaker on the circuit. I've been doing this for a long time. My marketing manager told me I had to put a thing about an award that we got last year. She tells me to do all these sorts of things. So just to go through where we're at in terms of what we're going to talk about today. So in this session, we're going to talk about insider threats. Now, I come at this from a business perspective. I kind of raise my flag very quickly and say I am not a technologist. I famously can't wire a plug. So I don't look at this from a technology standpoint. I talk to board levels, senior leadership teams, and help them to understand the threats that are out there and how best to mitigate them. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about this morning. Hopefully we can take away some euros. We're all experts on here. We're all professionals in our field and around cybersecurity. So some of the areas I may be teaching you to suck eggs. If I am, I apologize. But if I can give you one or two snippets to take away, then my job's done this morning. So what is the definition of an insider threat? So an insider threat is it's most simply defined as a security threat that originates from inside the organization, and it has a very, very wide scope to define that. Give me just 1 second. Something has gone very odd with my screen. Give me a second. Okay. Can you see my screen still?
Yeah, you're all clear.
Excellent. Yeah, sorry, my screen went blank for a second, so that was a bit strange. Anyway, so insider threats can be intentional, unintentional. It's a term that can refer to any individuals who gain access inside an organization, generally to information that they can have access to and want to do something or accidentally do something they shouldn't do, but also access to data that they shouldn't really have access to. And you can create a breach accidentally. And we'll come on to that in more in more depth a little bit later. It doesn't have to be a present or present employee or stakeholder within the business. It can be a former employee or anyone that still has access to the organization's data. And I'm sure we've all experienced throughout our careers at some point where we've left an organization, but we still have access to our files and folders for a period of time. And some unscrupulous people can take advantage of that, and some do. You've also got contractors, business associates. One that really interests me are the third-party supply chain, and Achim touched on that earlier, I believe. The third-party supply chain to access information within an organization is something that's always interesting as well. And the insider threat terminology, as I say, is very broad. Most threats are avoidable, but unfortunately, they're not. They're not dealt with, and again, we'll come at this from a kind of a business level as well. So, why is your data at risk of a breach? Well, when it comes to data security, the risk of a breach often comes down to one thing: complexity. I see this a lot. It's either too complex or not complex enough, and it's a really fine balancing act. Many organizations unknowingly leave themselves exposed because of the way that their systems and access controls have evolved over time, and it gets to the point where it grows and grows and grows, and they feel it's too difficult to untie all of that. If you look at excessive or legacy permissions, which is a great one to start with, old access rights that linger off longer than they often need to. People move roles, they change departments, or even they leave the company, but their access sticks around, creating unnecessary exposure to that data. Then you have complicated folder structures. Layer upon layer of nested folders make it incredibly difficult to manage who can access what. And it's very, very easy to lose track, and even easier for sensitive data to be left exposed. And then you've got IT who doesn't know who should have access. Now, IT teams are typically the gatekeepers, but they're not the data owners. And you may or may not be surprised to understand how many organizations don't understand that themselves. They don't understand who actually owns the data. The data owner generally should be the head of that department. So the data owner is the head of for finance is the head of finance. The data owner for development is the head of development and the CTO of the organization. It's the senior managers, the leaders within those departments that are technically the data owners. And IT, they don't know who actually needs access. And with most organizations still with the limited time and resources, they're just trying to keep the lights on. I have a lot of empathy for IT organizations within the businesses that I deal with on a consultative basis, because they're running around trying to keep servers going, and then they're asked to reset a password and do lots of mundane roles within IT that actually should be business processes. So we'll come on to that in a little bit. Lack of visibility. Many organizations simply don't have a clear view of who has access to what. And without that visibility, identifying the risk is nigh on impossible. And one that this is where I make my bread and butter, is that the board just isn't paying attention. If leadership doesn't see data access as a priority, it rarely gets the attention and, more importantly, the investment that it needs. And that leaves gaps. And what do hackers and threat vectors from outside love? They love gaps, because that's where they can get their ins. So, a couple of comments that I've had is, it's the board don't see it as a priority, and it's all a bit complicated. That's one of the very common phrases that I hear when I do board presentations is that the access rights and insider threats and how you control it, it's all complicated. And yeah, it is all a bit complicated, but that complexity is exactly what the attackers will exploit. Simplifying access, improving visibility, and making data ownership a shared responsibility is the first step towards giving you better security. So let's do the bit that scares most of the senior leadership teams and boards when I go and talk to them. We talk about the numbers themselves in 2024. So last year in 2024, the average cost of a data breach was about 4.88 million, and that's a 10% increase on 2023. And this is due to a number of factors: increased frequency of attacks, so data breaches are becoming more common. Increased sophistication, and it's something that Achim talked about earlier. The sophistication of breaches is increasing significantly. They're becoming more complex. They're becoming longer burns within organizations as well. So you'll have a piece of malicious code sitting there for quite a long period of time after it's been exposed, generally by an employee inside the organization. The increased costs, the data breaches are becoming more expensive to fix. And then when you start looking at hybrid cloud environments, these are going to be more expensive because you've got to protect the complexity of managing multiple environments. And a big one, and I think that is a common theme across the board, is that the shortage of cybersecurity skills in the marketplace at the moment in the UK. It's worsened over the last year, and it's leading to increased remediation costs. I've got to the point with a couple of my clients that are looking for, pre-sales engineers, first, second line support guys, where we've actually got a relationship with a couple of universities. So the Technical University in Reading, I've got a meeting with them straight after this to talk about how we can introduce some of their students into the business to build them from the ground up, because the cybersecurity skills shortage in the marketplace is getting quite serious in the UK, and those that are available are getting quite expensive as well, and that's another consideration. Some of the other data statistics to look at for last year: the average cost per record for a breach was $165. The average cost of what we call a mega breach, which is 50 to 60 million records, was around 375 million. The average cost of a data breach with a life cycle of over 200 days was 5.46 million. 51% of costs are incurred within the first year following that breach, and a lot of organizations can be significantly impacted from a negative standpoint because of that. And organizations with a high level of non-compliance are showing an average cost of 5.5 million. And it's nice to see in the UK that the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, is actually starting to get some teeth and put some fines in place and show that they're not afraid to put those fines and name and shame those organizations that are causing those breaches. So if we look at the impacts, just a very quick one on here, the Ponemon Institute's 2022 Global Insider Threat Report highlighted a 65% increase in the cost of credential theft, which went from 2.19 million in 2020 up to 3.6 million in 2022. Mimecast's 2024 Annual Data Exposure Report noted that the average cost of an insider incident reached $15 million, with a 28% increase in insider-driven events since 2021. Ponemon also said that the time to contain an insider threat increased from 77 days to 85 days, and that's because they are becoming more complex, which again refers back to a bit of what Achim was talking about in the complexity of these things. And incidents taking over 90 days cost organizations on average $13.5 million annually. So these numbers are not insignificant. And I should also add that I'm not talking about the HSBCs and the GlaxoSmithKlines and British Airways of this world. The vast majority of breaches occur in that small to medium business space. And the reason for that being is that they just don't have the solutions in place. They don't have the experience, they don't have the time or the manpower to be able to protect themselves. And that is where we're seeing a lot of the challenges becoming. The large corporates, yes, they're getting attacked every day, but they've got very large systems and very experienced people and lots of people to help contain those threats. And that's where we're seeing the vast majority of breaches occurring, from that small to medium business up to kind of 5,000 users within an organization. Then you've got the fun regulatory perspectives on data breaches that are caused by insider threats, and they focus on protecting sensitive data and personally identifiable information. PCI information, PDI, things like that. You've got good old GDPR. GDPR applies to organizations processing personal data of individuals within the European Union and further afield. And that includes the UK under Data Protection Act of 2018. And you've got the insider threat implications of that, where organizations must ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of personal data. Insider threats, such as the misuse of access or negligence, can constitute a violation of GDPR. My wife works for a charity, and she received an email that had the email address of every employee within and volunteer within that charity on the to field. That in itself is a breach, because they weren't all business email addresses, they were personal email addresses as well. And that organization as well, yesterday or the day before, decided it was a good idea to give the personal cell numbers of every employee of the organization that was receiving a new laptop to DHL, to enable them to give them a delivery time and give them delivery updates of the laptop that was coming. Without without permission of doing that, that's a GDPR breach. It's very small things, but they all add up. You got the UK Data Protection Act 2018, which kind of falls in line with GDPR. Then you get the fun ones like the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority. They focus on protecting client data, operational risk, and maintaining system integrity. And then the National Cybersecurity Centre that I spent a lot of time with. They kind of give an umbrella overview. They don't particularly have any teeth, but they're very good at giving advice, which is very important, especially for that SME market that don't really know where to get that advice from. The NCSC are very good at that. There are a whole bunch of regulatory things that I could go through. I could spend probably an hour on that, but I won't. I'll move forward. But there are. The point of this is that from a business perspective, there is so much that organizations have to adhere to, and it's a lot of work, and it astonishes me that organizations don't take security more seriously. As I say, I'm seeing some of the same threats that I saw 30 years ago still being talked about today in exactly the same way. They're just getting more sophisticated. So let's look at some of the preventative measures that we can put in place to mitigate the risks of the insider breaches. Organizations should implement a combination of technical, administrative, and behavioral measures. And I'm talking about the human element of the insider threats. So one of the things I talked about just now was access control and management. So implement a role-based access controls to limit access to employees who need it for their job function. Use the principle of least privilege to minimize unnecessary access to sensitive data, which essentially is give access to people that they need access to that data at that time for that period of time to perform their role. Regular reviews and updates of user access permissions, especially after role changes within an organization or terminations, are very important. Make sure an organization enforces multi-factor authentication for accessing specifically sensitive information systems and data. And that's very important for when the users are working remotely, which is, as we know, is a very common thing post-COVID, that we have a very strong hybrid model in the UK. Let's make sure that a laptop hasn't been stolen and people are trying to get access to it. Just very simple things like that. Monitoring and logging is very important. Deploy real-time monitoring tools to detect unusual behavior within an organization, such as why is that person accessing this large volume of data when they've never accessed it before? Make sure you have alerts for that. Maintain comprehensive audit logs of users' activities, such as files access, downloads, email communications, making sure that they're not sending information out of an organization that they shouldn't be. But more importantly, they're not clicking on something when an email comes in that's been missed by the email gateway. They're not clicking on a link that is going to do something nefarious within the organization. Data protection and encryption. Make sure you encrypt sensitive data. A lot of organizations still don't encrypt their data. They think it's too expensive, too much hard work. There's lots of solutions out there these days that are much, much better at it, both for data at rest, but also data in transit. So data that's been sent via email or other things. Don't ever let your users within organizations use things like WeTransfer. I can guarantee you that gets scanned by the Chinese government, and Dropbox tell me that there are 8 petabytes of sensitive data sitting on just their UK servers, because people will load it up there, send the link to say it's there, and because we're very task-based within our roles within work, we've done that task, we move on to something else and forget to take it down in most instances. So making sure that we all understand the importance of where that sensitive data and data itself is resting is very important. One that is very dear to my heart is employee training and awareness, making sure that there is a campaign within the organization to continually educate employees, continually make them aware of what they need to be doing, what they need to be adhering to. And most of you will probably be thinking the 1 hour a year that the employees within your organizations do your security awareness training. Again, human psyche tells us that when we are forced to do something like security awareness training, we will do what we can do to get through it as quickly as possible. And then 5 minutes later, we've forgotten over 90% of what we've learned in that process, because our brains are telling us that we don't actually need that. We don't want to learn that. And we move on to something else. We've seen instances where employees have done their security awareness training, and less than 5 minutes later, they were sent a fake email from the IT team, and they opened the attachment, and it would have been something that could have caused a virus to get into the organization. The simulated phishing exercise is always very important to reinforce employee vigilance, and it's not about beating employees with a stick. It's making them aware, educating them, but educating them in a way that is not like you're beating them with a stick. You've got to use the whole carrot approach. Make sure with policies and procedures that you develop and enforce a clear insider threat policy, which is outlining acceptable behavior, data access protocols, and consequences for violations for employees. Implement a data classification framework to identify and protect sensitive information, and establish a secure communications channel for sharing sensitive information, both inside and outside the organization, with customers and third-party companies that you work with. Something that a lot of organizations don't do properly is pre-employment screening. Make sure that you conduct a thorough background check during the hiring process to identify potential risks. There are, because people are hiring from abroad, and they're hiring remote teams and remote organizations, they don't really do the full background check and do the checks and balances of third-party companies that they're bringing in, and also employees as well. Make sure you've got an insider threat program that you can dedicate and to educate the threat management teams and oversee and respond to insider threats. Regularly assess and improve your insider threat detection response and capabilities. It's an ongoing process. Threats are always changing. The key to this though is humans. It's humans that are the key to this. Your employees and your third party organizations. It comes down to making sure they know where they should be looking out for threats. Just don't just assume that IT have taken care of it. Then you've got technology safeguards such as privileged access management tools to monitor the control of administrative accounts. Implement application whitelisting to restrict the use of unauthorized software and tools that employees. Now, I'm not talking specifically about developers, because as we agreed in Achim's presentation, developers want the freedom and the ability to access and download particular tools. That same rule doesn't apply to employees within the organization that work in sales or finance or marketing or administration. And then always look at your third party vendor contracts and understand what their SLAs are, understand what safeguards they're putting in place, and make sure you've got a very robust instant response planning process as well. Really, in conclusion, and I'm sure I've got some questions coming my way, but I've tried to whiz through this as quickly as possible. This is actually a presentation that we take 2 days to present to boards in quite a lot of detail. As technologies evolve, make sure that you are aware of the threats that evolve around them, and make the necessary updates within your organization. The insider threat will account for over 75% of the data breaches within your organization. And a lot of organizations don't like to admit that. They also, I wrote a piece recently actually that went out around the balance between security and the Security Balancing Act, between allowing your employees the freedom to do what they want without being overlooked and monitored too much as well. And I can send you a copy of that as well. Make sure that your organization is training and making your employees aware of the threats at all times. The one final thought I'll leave you with, it's when it comes to security and threats, I always remember and always refer back to Donald Rumsfeld. I just think it's one of the greatest statements ever made in terms of the knowing the unknowns. I won't read it out. It's there for you to read. I'm sure you're all aware of it. But you can only fix what you can see. You only know what you know, and you also don't know what you don't know, which I think is great. Education is absolutely key from a end user perspective. Making sure that they're educated, but they're not forced to do it, or it's applied in a way that isn't forcing them to do it, because human nature, human psyche is, if you're trying to make us do it, we're not going to do it, or we'll put the least amount of effort in to do it and then move on to something else, and our brains won't acknowledge that. Thank you very much for your time. I have whisked through this as quickly as I can because I know I've only got 30 minutes, but if you have any questions, please do let me know.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. So I think that's kind of interesting because we've really had a kind of bottom-up kind of thought process about the security side, and then we've had a very, very top-down sort of model, and it just kind of demonstrates the breadth that we in the cyber teams have to deal with, from that top-level executive down to the practical software developer and what they're dealing with. I am going to just highlight something actually, because you've mentioned it several times. I need to connect you with an organization called MindHug. They won some funding from Cyberlocal in the last round for the Southwest, and they've been running programs about specifically about behavioral change coaching, so coaching the coaches on
Yep,
behavioral change coaching specifically for cybersecurity,
that's interesting.
which I think is kind of interesting and cool because it kind of addresses that issue you raise that, if you force people into training, they almost switch off. It's like, yeah, let me get through this now.
Yep,
They have a program and a researched model that looks at it and says, okay, this is a behavioral change problem, not a cybersecurity problem first.
yep.
And recognizing that and connecting the two is what they're up to. And I'm quite interested and excited to see how they evolve and develop that.
That'd be a really interesting to have a conversation with them about that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I know them well. I'm actually personally working with them with my day hat on as well, with from the point of view of providing them a digital platform to deploy what they're doing. So, bit of a open commercial plug there, but I think what they're doing is really relevant to what you were just saying. Um, I also think from the stats you were talking about, I don't know, but I suspect because I see these stats as well all of the time, and I
Yep.
think what's interesting about the insider stat is what it's about is the successful attacks, because a lot of the stats we see are about attacks,
Yeah, I
right?
didn't talk about that in itself, but you're absolutely right. We only know about the attacks we know about, and it's the whole Rumsfeld thing at the end there. We don't know what we don't know, and when I speak to a lot of organizations, say, and again, especially in the SME space, they don't believe they've been breached. They still don't believe they ever will be breached. And the fact is, do you know what, chaps? You probably have been breached. You just don't know about it.
Yeah, exactly. So, open to questions. I see Akim's got a question, which is good. So, Akim,
Yes, if I understood it correctly, most of the threats that you summarized were something I would call the unintentional threat. So where people accidentally do bad stuff, and that happens a lot. And I think for those, it's also important to establish a culture where people that make a mistake feel safe in speaking up and saying something went wrong. In my former life in industry, I had those type of situations where employees accidentally published company confidential data, recognized that, and then alarmed the security team to mitigate the issue. And that happened without punishment. And I think that open culture for those type of situations is also very important. It's different when you have a malicious internal threat actor. But at least to the best that I know of, we hardly have any data about malicious internal threat actors. I know a couple of examples in the software field. There, the interesting aspect is that people build in backdoors in systems essentially in their first day of work and maintain them over 15, 20 years of a career.
And that's where I talk about doing a full background check for new employees. Sometimes some guys are going to get through. But it's making sure that you do everything you can and use not only the human behavioral part of it and the reference side, but making sure you employ the right technologies within your organization to help detect and stop these threats when they're happening. You're absolutely right. Over 70% of so the it's a strange statistic because the statistic hasn't changed in over 30 years, which I just find astonishing. And I reviewed this last week just to make sure I was still right. But when I started with content technologies that created Mailsweeper, which was the email content checking tool, the statistic that we came out with after doing some customer reviews and surveys was that you found that 70% of all threats that occurred that we know about were caused by insiders, not external attacks. And of those 70% of those threats, 75 of those were unintentional breaches, where somebody has sent something to the wrong person, there somebody hasn't encrypted a file, or an email has come in with an attachment, and the user, the employee within the organization has looked at the email. It looks real, and if it looks real, they click the attachment. And one of the key ones at the moment is the whole whaling side of things, where what this actually happened to one of my clients, not probably this time last year, where the CFO received an email purportedly from the CEO saying, "Can you pay this invoice?" And it was a spoofed email, and it looked just like it had come from the CEO, other than there was an initial in between his first name and last name, and it had come from his Gmail account, and the CFO paid it. And it was a not insignificant amount of money into a bank account for what was supposed to have been some software that had been bought for the organization. And she fell for it. And that's a cybersecurity company. So they still it happens to everybody. Um, whilst attacks are getting more sophisticated, I still fundamentally believe that the challenge that we have as organizations is making sure that we make our employees aware of the basics, because it's the basics where the gaps occur, in terms of employing the right technologies to pick these things up in the first place. But if they do get through, that whole human behavioral thing that Jeff was talking about, making sure that they do stop and just think for a second. But a lot of employers don't think it's worth spending the time and money in doing that, but it really is.
I've got a observational question, which I've seen. So I've worked to try and get into the NHS with some technology platforms that solve a lot of the problems you talked about. And
Hmm.
one of the assumptions I had on entry was, oh, we'll need to understand our customers' definition of roles so that we can align our entry point of our platform to their needs. Kind of scarily, for example, in GPs, there is no role-based definition.
No.
Every person inside that GP surgery who works there has access to every single patient record of every single person connected to that GP. And there are no role-based functions at all. And worse than that, there are no um, trust and verify implementation models that I would trust that are going on behind the scenes either. So the question I have is that what I see, and the NHS is just a kind of an extreme, horrible example, but I've
It
seen
is.
it everywhere.
Whatever it is you're going to say, it is an extreme and horrible example. Yeah.
That's an extreme and horrible example, but the point is that when you try to implement role-based access, you constrain the innovative capacity of the organization to execute to a business process model that's very limited, and that is very frustrating to staff. And so there's a very interesting balancing act for how you implement role-based models and facilitating the natural human imperative to do what's necessary, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, in the job. I just wonder what your comments or thoughts are on that when you talk to the executive board about that kind of balancing act.
So one of the questions I always ask, when we do board reviews is, I ask some pretty basic questions that I'm generally confident of what the answer will be. That old adage of don't ask a question you don't already know the answer to. One of the questions I always ask around role-based access is who's responsible, whose job is it, and the overriding answer, and I'm not exaggerating when I say 9 times out of 10, the overriding answer is IT, and it's not. It's and then we go through a a program of education at first of all at the board level to educate them that whilst IT have got a fundamental role within role-based access, they are the providers of the platform and the managers of the platform to enable the data owners to provide access. I worked with one of my old clients, was an access a role-based access management company, and they did it very, very well, which was to, before they even implemented the software or started to roll it out, they had a program in place that they could deliver to the organization to help educate the data owners. So the first thing you need to do is, from an IT perspective, is you need to understand where your data is, who has access to it. Then you need to understand from a data owner's point of view. So again, head of IT, head of finance, they may give that job to somebody else within their organization, but ultimately they are the owner of the data. Their role there is to say, yes, Jeff needs access to this data to perform his role. Simon needs access to his data to perform this role. Achim needs data to perform his role, and so on and so forth, within their particular departments. And then IT will can manage that. Now there are technologies. So my old client they have a technology where access is given and revoked by the data owner. And that's where I believe it should be. It shouldn't be within IT. IT are the enablers. They're not the data owners. And it's also the role of the data owner to perform those regular reviews to make sure that people have got the right access to the right data at the right time. But it's also important to remember that or users within the organization need to have a clear and defined path to request access to data that they need. But make sure that if they're requesting the data, they're requesting it from the data owner, but the data owner doesn't give open-ended access, because that's a huge area that we didn't even talk about time limiting access to data, to ensure that if somebody's working on a project for 6 months, that they only have access to that data for 6 months. And if it does need to be extended, there's a simple process involved from the user to the data owner to request an extension for that. And without those checks and balances in place, it's always going to fall back on IT. And it's not, they're not the people that should be culpable for this. And I have a lot of sympathy for the cybersecurity teams, the data management teams within organizations. When I do these board level meetings, and there's this is all IT. And if I can't convince the board that actually it's the data owners, the heads of departments, and actually, Mr. CEO, it's you that can potentially go to jail and receive a massive fine, not somebody, not Dave in IT because he forgot to do something. You ultimately are responsible. You ultimately are the owner of this data. Then I'm not doing my job right. And more often than not, we get the results that we're looking for. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
Yep, that's a good and fair answer, I would say. So I think just one further comment on it was Rich Carpenter put a comment further up in the chat I saw earlier on, that he's sort of saying that if you connect that question with the other point you make about the onboarding or the bringing somebody into the organization, is that that's a great opportunity for the IT cyber team to connect with HR and set these things up from day one as part of the onboarding process. And
Yep.
some companies do try and do that. But it's not what I haven't witnessed is that it's a sustainable process. It's a one-off. It's kind of like, yeah, we've done it now. Great, job done, move on.
Okay, so that's quite an interesting comment because is it Richard that made that comment?
Rich Carpenter, yeah.
Richard, thank you. It's a really interesting comment because if you've got a new employee coming into your organization, if you're not deploying and using the right technologies, one of two things is going to happen. That employee is going to start on day one and have no access to anything, and they're sitting there twiddling their thumbs for the first day, 2, 3 days, depending on the size of the organization and the speed of the speed of reaction from HR and IT and the relationship as well, and also the personal relationship between the two. The other thing that happens, in fact, there's three things. The second thing that happens is somebody will join an organization, and let's say that Jeff has worked for ABC company for 15 years, and Achim is going to join that organization in the same department. What access rights does Achim need? Give him the same as Jeff, because he's in the same department. That happens far too often. So what Achim is now inheriting are 15 years worth of Jeff's access rights, which means that Jeff's worked in four different departments over 15 years. He's worked in did a bit of work in finance. He was seconded into IT for a little bit. Now he's doing this. Now he's doing that. So you are spreading the disease, if you like, within your organization just by doing that.
I think that Rich Carpenter has commented again on that. He's sort of answered the question in a way because he said data access recertification should be built into governance audits.
It should be. And the word should be is quite important. The way that I recommend access is given to new employees, it's not actually an IT role at all. IT provide them with a laptop and the phone and the connectivity, but the access to the data is a conversation between the data owner and HR, and then the data owner gives that access. That's
And IT's just given
that's
them the
what
tools to
should
do it.
happen.
Yeah.
Generally, it's without if you haven't got the right technologies within your organization, IT will have to do it. But if you're using a solid access rights management tool, it can be done by HR because it's a role-based definition. Somebody that works in this department doing this role should have only access to this data as a standard data set. If they require additional access to additional data, then that is where they can make that request either through a data request program or through a piece of software itself that enables that. There are technologies out there. There are good technologies out there that enable this to happen. But there are also technologies that enable this to happen that are far too expensive and far too complex. And organizations look at it and say, it's too much like hard work. Let's just continue doing it this way. And they'll do role-based access reviews on Excel spreadsheets, which is not the right way to do it because by the time it's gone through to the data owners, assuming that you're doing it that way, by the time that review has been done in over a 3-month period, the data access requests have changed and people need access to different data, so it's out of date straight away.
Yeah. Cool, excellent. We've gone over a lot longer than we normally do, but people have been hanging on, so
Sorry
obviously
about that. I'm a
interesting
talker.
conversation. No, that's fine. If people are hanging on and listening in, then it's fine. We'll keep going as long as it takes. So thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much, Achim. Excellent talks. Lots of good stuff. We will, as ever, take this recording and put it up onto our YouTube channel and promote it. So if you thought it was useful and somebody in your department or organization needs to see it, do pass it on. And hopefully I'll be seeing you guys at Secure Southwest. If you haven't signed up, please do so. I would like to see you there. And let's continue this drive to make cyber something for good for our Southwest community. Brilliant stuff. And Simon, I'll follow up with you on MindHug as well.
Yeah, super. I'll see you next Thursday, Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah, I can talk to you about it then.
Excellent. Yeah, give me a call because there's something else I want to ask you about that as well.
Yeah, I can follow up with you now if you like. Well, actually, I've got a quick
Yeah,
call.
give me till 12 because I've got calls from 10:30 till 12.
No, no worries. Okay, all right. So Tim, can you hang on because we'll just have a quick chat about the cyber local stuff. And thanks everybody else.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
See you next month.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah. It's removing a few extra people. Okay. Cool. All right. Perhaps I'll just see if I can get that document up. Hold on a second. So me and Tim have worked on a document for cyber local submission tonight. Just wanted to give everybody a chance to cock their leg over it, so to speak. I think I copied it to everyone except Chelsea. Um, so you should have access to it. Do you have access to it?
I've got it up on screen if you want me to share it.
Yep, go on then. I'm not sure Anthony's actually still here. His screen seems to be locked. Yeah, that's the one. Why don't you just remove all the track changes so that we, or at least not the view of them anyway. There we go. So the basic intention here really is to connect two of our thoughts and initiatives and see if we can get DSIT to fund it. One is the general thrust around ESG and cyber for good, and the other is to get out physically across the regions into the um, vertical market segments that we know are substantive in the region, space and maritime, etc. I threw clean tech in there as well because I know Tech Southwest are working hard to pull together a clean tech group, and it makes sense for us to kind of connect with that if we can, particularly with the E and ESG.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. So you can have a quick read it if you like, but essentially what we're saying, if you just scroll down, we're looking to run, I think, 3 events over the time period of the cyber local and seek just enough money. I think 10K per event is a lot, but
I was trying to kind of sneak it over the 25K and kind of sort of
well, I say it's a
bring it up.
lot. It's a lot from the point of view of the way in which we run costs at the moment. It's not a lot for an event.
No.
I mean, we do it on an absolute fucking shoestring. Um, so the fact that we're able to still do it. Oh, actually, I should turn the recording off. Hold on.